Welcome to today's Global Connections television program. I'm Bill Miller. The main purpose of this show is to promote a discussion of major international issues such as war and peace, economic and social development, climate change, and human rights that impact people worldwide. New knowledge will inspire, involve, and motivate all of us to better deal with these challenges and to help create a better world. Today's program is going to focus upon the various types of information being provided by the United Nations to policymakers, to the media, and the general public. We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at the United Nations and the various types of information that's provided through its agencies, through its programs, through its statistics, through its studies, and a wide range of other sources. My guest today is an expert on the United Nations and this type of information. My guest today is Dr. Nanette Svenson. Dr. Nanette Svenson directs the Panama programming for Tulane University's Masters of Global Development in Panama. She also works as a consultant for the United Nations and other international organizations. Her most recent book is The United Nations as a Knowledge System. Dr. Nanette Svenson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. You have written a very interesting book that we're going to get into. It's as I mentioned, the United Nations as a Knowledge System, and it's very comprehensive, excellent overview of the UN system. How did you decide you wanted to write a book about the United Nations?
Well, before I went back to school to get my doctorate and move more into academia, I worked for the United Nations for quite a number of years, mainly with the UNDP at the regional base for Latin America and the Caribbean and Panama, but in other offices around the world as well. So when I had my PhD and came to Tulane as a professor and was giving graduate courses on the UN, I was trying to talk about the area in which I had worked, which was in knowledge and information services, capacity development, knowledge management, and I couldn't find very much. So I started to compile what I could find, and at some point Routledge came to me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing a book on this?"
And the rest is history, as they say. So there we go.
Signed up for that.
Exactly. Well, the United Nations, as we recall, really came out of the ashes of war, of World War II, with over 60 million people killed. Europe lay in ruins. Parts of Asia had been destroyed. It was an absolute disaster. And of course, the UN was created to focus attention on economic and social development, to eliminate the scourge of war, and to promote human rights. How were you able to draw upon the history of the United Nations? And bring that in and talk about the 6 organs of the UN, like the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Trusteeship Council, different things like that? How did you bring this? The UN is a very complex organization. It's not huge as far as personnel-wise, numbers-wise, but it is very complex, and it provides basic services to us in all parts of the world every day. But how did you bring all of that together?
Well, this was a gargantuan task. It was more ambitious than I realized at the outset, of course, for all the reasons that you're mentioning. And I had experience within one particular sector of the UN, which was more development and humanitarian assistance oriented. So when I started to write this book, the introduction begins with a bit of the history and all the different organs and bodies that make up the UN. And it is a bit overwhelming. And so what I have done throughout the book is I've chosen to focus on the different types of knowledge and information that we're discussing categorically. And then I bring all of the different examples that I talk about in these different categories from the most relevant bodies, whether they're, funds and programs in the development area, whether it's UN Secretariat, General Assembly, peacekeeping, whatever. So I've tried to do that. It's tricky, and another book could be written on the same topic completely differently and from different perspectives and angles. I'm hoping that will start to happen.
And they certainly could. Now, if our viewers would like more information on this, what we're talking about, they can go to your website, nsvenson.com, and get more information on this. But let's jump into, that's a good segue into the three sections. And the first is the social and organizational learning. How would you define social and organizational learning as far as one of those three component areas?
Okay, social and organizational learning for the UN is how the UN uses its knowledge to teach and train and educate its organization, its internal staff, and also its external public. The social learning is more the external, and the organizational applies to the UN staff inside. But then there are these areas of crossover as well. So there are three chapters to that part of the book. There are the internal initiatives, which are the staff training endeavors like the UN Staff College, like UNITAR for the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, others. External social learning areas are more like the university programs the UN has. It has its own university that many people don't know. University U Peace in Costa Rica. Lots of university programming, actually. And other programs like the Global Compact, which seeks to bring in the private sector. UN Academic Impact, which seeks to bring in universities. There are a lot of those. And then there's another area which is mixed initiatives, which is a combination of the internal staff and public training and information dissemination.
And you mentioned several very important programs there that the UN has. And the one, just to focus on one, the Global Compact, that came out of the Davos Summit, the Economic Summit, when Kofi Annan was Secretary General, as I recall. And of course, that is a major program that's involving, as I recall, over 9,000 businesses from around the world that come together and focus on 10 major areas in human rights, in combating problems such as a violation of human rights or labor violations, things like that. But it's a major program that's really becoming much more popular with the private sector, and they're focusing upon corruption too, which is certainly helpful. Did you focus in great detail on that, or did you go into much depth on the Global Compact? Now, just use that as one example.
Yeah, not great depth, but we definitely mentioned it in one of those. In the front section of social learning, because it was, as you point out, the first time that the UN actually connected directly and massively with the private sector and tried to align goals for joint sort of programming, mainly for businesses to take on some of the UN mission objectives and embed them in a lot of their daily operations around these 10 sort of themes that you're discussing, and it's actually taken off. It's been criticized for lots of different reasons, but it really is the biggest private sector corporate responsibility platform and endeavor of its kind. I think it's even gone beyond the 9,000 now, because they've begun to incorporate civil society organizations, university organizations, and it's become a big pool of sort of private sector corporate responsibility knowledge.
And that's very, very true. And this is something that's changing quite dramatically with corporate social responsibility. And as you mentioned now, we might mention too, the Global Compact is totally voluntary. A business does not have to join, but by the same token, if that business does become a member, it has to meet it has certain criteria.
Yes.
And if it doesn't maintain that criteria or meet those standards, it's dropped. Because we've talked to previous heads of the Global Compact, and they've dropped several hundred, maybe thousands.
Thousands
of people
and there's
have been
a
dropped.
list of, they're signed up, but they're not participating. It does involve pretty extensive end of the year or annual reporting on what your company or your group is doing on these different topics. And I think for some of the smaller companies that have gotten involved, if you're not Microsoft or L'Oreal and you don't have a big, PR and communications department, if you're in a developing country and they have many developing country participants, it's a little harder to get that wherewithal for the reporting organized and dedicated, I think, sometimes. So
you were talking about the internal operation of the United Nations, and the UN, as I've viewed it, I teach a course on the UN. I've watched it as someone from the outside, observing the UN over the a long time, shall we say. But it seems to me that the internal operation of the UN, the reforms, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there have been a lot more internal reforms of the UN. I know when Kofi Annan came in, Secretary General, he had a two-track approach to make the UN more efficient and to make it more effective.
Yes.
And there were certain things that he could do, certain things he couldn't do. Of course, Ban Ki-moon has continued through the reform procedures and that type of thing. How do you view that as far as the UN becoming a more effective and more efficient organization as compared to maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago, if going back some?
That's a good question. I actually started working with the UN exactly 15 years ago. So that's sort of been my range of participation, and a lot of what I know about the UN comes from the Kofi Annan administration and forward. It is completely unwieldy. There is still an awful lot of reform to be done, but I think Kofi Annan did a huge service to the UN and to all of the individual bodies that make it up, particularly by focusing on knowledge. I quote him at the very beginning of the book. He said in, I believe it was a 1997 address of his, he started talking about knowledge management. He said, knowledge is power, information is liberating, education is the premise of progress, in every society, in every family. And it was widely quoted, and he started really following up on that with knowledge management, with information gathering and documentation. And he aligned that also with his Delivering as One program and campaign. He was trying to get all of the UN bodies, and there are so many, we don't even know, what's the UN? Most people think about General Assembly, the Security Council, maybe the building here in New York with the flags, but there are so many different operations. There's the World Health Organization, UNICEF, World Food, dozens. So he tried to get everybody on the same page as far as delivery in countries and on programs. And he got as far as he could during his term, and a lot remains to be done on that. But you saw some key stuff come out of that, like UN Women, bringing all the gender-oriented organizations. AIDS, UN AIDS, also same thing, where they sort of collected different groups that were working on similar thematic issues and tried to target them better.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately financed, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Our viewers are invited to check out the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous shows. If you're interested in distributing our shows through PBS, Community Access Television, educational institutions, a website, or any other media outlet, please go to our website for more information. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service at no cost. Today we're looking at the United Nations and the various types of information that the UN provides both internally and externally. My guest is an expert on the UN. My guest is Dr. Nanette Svenson. Dr. Svenson just recently wrote a book, The United Nations as a Knowledge System. Nanette, we're talking about this very interesting book, and it is a very comprehensive book. I don't want to get bogged down on the first point. We still have two more to go. But as you look at the United Nations, I think you're absolutely right as far as, and everybody I think at the UN and outside of the UN will agree that the UN still has a ways to go as far as reforming doing organizational type of rearrangement, that type of thing. There's overlap at times, some duplication of programs, but it's an international body, an intergovernmental body, shall we say, of 193 member states. All the country, basically every country of the world is a member of the United Nations. What do you think the UN? How has the UN done, or what can be done? I know your book and other things are being done to help the general public better understand the UN. You mentioned a whole potpourri of activities of the UN, and it is a very complex system, but they're all providing basic services to us. You mentioned the World Health Organization, working with Rotary International to eliminate polio, the UN Children's Fund involved with Kiwanis to eliminate, Kiwanis International to eliminate iodine deficiency disorders. You look at the UN works with airlines all around the world. You came in on COPA to work with airlines to move aircraft safely in international airspace, to move ships, mail, weather information. All these are basic services that we rely upon, and we need these UN agencies. How can the public better understand these services? Because the public does not. The polls show that we do not understand them. But they could buy your book. I know that's one way of doing it. But are there other ways? The media can play a role in this, the universities. Who can help get this word out to inform the public about the United Nations and the critical role it plays? Not saying it's a perfect organization. I'm not saying that. No. But it's an absolutely essential organization.
It is essential, and it produces so much information, produces and manages so much information and world knowledge that I sense people have no sense of whatsoever. I think the ways there are so many different types of information. We talked about the internal and external social and organizational training and education. There's also, the normative ways that the UN goes about the international agreement making, and then the monitoring and measuring of global indicators on human development, on the status of the world's children, on the state of the world's forests, water quality, all of that kind of activity. And there's so many publications that the UN puts out annually that are free of charge, just like your show, online. And if people go and explore, I think the UN doesn't have large budgets for disseminating all that they're doing, but quite a bit of it, and the historical collections are available online through the Department of Public Information, through the UN headquarters, also through the individual agencies, Food and Agricultural Organization, the UNDP, UNICEF, World Health. They all have extensive online libraries and document sites. So those are some of the ways. Again, I feel like everything I mentioned is just the tip of the iceberg. It depends. If you want to redo your education system nationally, that's UNESCO and many of its institutes.
We probably would take 3 days to just do the primer on the UN because it is so complicated.
It is complicated.
Again, and as you mentioned, it does provide these services. Now, we mentioned your website, but also if our viewers would like, they can go to un.org and tap into any of these topics we've been talking about. And most of the UN agencies, you can just type in like World Health Organization, WHO.org, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO.org, and go right into their websites. You mentioned the norm setting, and that is really an important part of the UN and how it does develop conferences, it develops agreements, treaties. We saw the Paris Agreement that came out in December of this past year on climate change, a major program or major issue to bring the countries of the world, and not only the countries, the governments, but also the private sector, to bring the non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups, Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, Lions clubs, everybody who has an interest in this. And that is one of the strengths of the UN, is it not?
Yes, definitely. I think that that global platform for negotiating and agreeing is definitely one of the major strengths. Certainly we're documenting what we all agree on, or what the majority of the world agrees on, whether it's with regard to water, climate change, health, development, peace, genocide. We're documenting that, and that's a precedent and a reference. So regardless of the degree of success that we have with keeping those agreements, they start as being documented in in this platform. And that gives us a benchmark, you know, where we can come back to with regard to then monitoring, measuring, publishing, keeping track of the indicators, keeping track of how our world is doing with regard to what it is that we say we agree on and want to work toward. And I think that's a huge, often sort of undersold value of the UN. It doesn't get a great deal of coverage, and not in that way whereby you see what happens when an international norm is adopted, like the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, or now the Sustainable Development Goals. What all goes into that? You know, how did that come about? I detail that in the book. That is one of the examples that I take and kind of go through the whole process, since it's now been a 20-year process practically. And it's interesting to see how the UN and everybody else is involved in that give and take of the formulation, of the agreement, of the nationalization of it in the 193 member countries, how then indicators get chosen, measuring gets done, monitoring, follow-up, reporting, discussion, debates on shows like these. You know, it's a very complex and contiguous process that sets norms for the world, and it's hard to be very specific about what is and isn't achieved sometimes. But looking at the whole, which is what I'm trying to do, you know, with this book, I feel puts things in a slightly broader context and shows how the UN is hugely necessary and really actually practically utilized for taking this kind of action forward.
And of course it does. It has resources we were talking about a moment ago, working with the private sector, working with a wide range of folks to provide services, but it also has this reservoir of statistics, of studies that have been done just for the private sector to use, educational institutions, just on across the board. And that may tie into your third point. We may already be into it. We're just getting short on time, but knowledge for the creation of products and services. How would you summarize that? You've already dealt with it a little bit, I guess, but how would you focus on that?
That third part of the book is the one that is dedicated to the area that I started off knowing more about, because that's where I worked, in the sort of knowledge management, capacity development, innovation portion of the UNDP and then other agencies, which are now developing sort of a series of consulting-like products and services for the different member countries, and primarily the developing countries in the group. Just like a business would go to McKinsey and Company, or Bain and Company, or the Boston Consulting Group to get some help about how to reorient or study or redirect certain of its organizational practices. The UN is now providing that kind of service for governments in countries all over the world. So if there's education reform, for example, that would like to take advantage of UN knowledge, UNESCO has many institutes dedicated to planning and implementation of policy, also curriculum development, also teacher training. There are places to go for that kind of consulting services. The UNDP does quite a bit with government in every category: legal, justice, health, welfare, urban development, local governance. It's vast, and there are so many different agencies working on these consulting-like services with different country governments, and that's kind of where I was hoping to go with that final portion of the book.
Well, in our last 30 seconds or so, what message would you have for our viewers to help them or motivate all of us, me included, to perhaps learn more about the United Nations? And we've talked a little bit about why it's important, but what can we do to learn a lot more about it? Because the media do not cover the United Nations. They cover the Security Council, peacekeeping, and that's about it unless there's a disaster. But what can we do, very briefly?
I'm not sure. Just look. Go onto Google and look at whatever you're interested in and type United Nations in quotes after whatever it is you're looking for. And see, there will be something. There will be something. The United Nations is involved in everything. And then you will see, what kind of information they're perhaps producing that might be free and of use to you. The UN has information centers across the world also, and those are excellent, open to the public spots, as well as the libraries that are available in headquarters here in New York and Vienna and Geneva, but also through depository libraries that are linked with universities and world capitals everywhere.
Exactly. And you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. That would be an excellent project for all of us. Just go Google Sustainable Development Goals, because when we had the Millennium Development Goals, literally tens of thousands of groups, faith-based groups, service clubs, were working on these, but the majority of the people did not know that that was happening. But Nanette Svenson, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very important program. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed today's program. Please join us again for the next episode of Global Connections Television. I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for watching.